So, as a reminder, these handouts are available in our BIO210 handouts folder that you can find on Canvas. This one is for chapter 1. And hopefully what you've already done is gone ahead and watched the Darwin's observations of finch beak shape and recent genetic screens, and looked at the specific genes that they have identified, which you can see in here. You can either have a T variant or a C variant. That will either give you a larger beak or a pointy beak, or a rounded beak or a pointy beak. And that is specifically in the ALX1 gene. And that's one way that we can look at genetics and see how things can change and give different traits for different offspring. However, hopefully what you read in the second one, based on recent observations of rural versus urban populations of finches, that it's not only in the genetic sequence change within the DNA that can cause a change in what an organism looks like, or what the trait, or how the trait is expressed. Hopefully, what you got from that second one is that there are other mechanisms, and it's not the sequence, but it's epigenetic mechanisms. So basically how the gene is regulated. So same sequence, but different regulation can lead to different changes in the expression patterns of the gene, which means there can be different traits, or expression of modified traits, even though the DNA sequence is the same. And so I'm going to bring that. You should have already seen that. I just wanted to highlight those 2 points. And I'm going to bring that to the concept of genetics versus genomics. So when we think about genetics, I personally think of that it's a little bit boring. And not that it's actually boring, because it's kind of cool. Punnett squares are interesting. How we inherit things is interesting. However, now that we know so much more, we know that it's not just this DNA sequence will lead to this. It's how everything works together. And so when we think about genetics versus genomics, I mean, you've got the definitions that are already listed on your handout, and that's fine. And we're thinking about that genetic variation and how we're going to inherit from one generation to the next. I think of the concept of genetics as kind of originally discovered by Mendel back in the 1800s. I think of that as really simple. It's just, you have these genes and you have the possibility to pass these on to your children at this rate or percentage or probability. But if we think about genomics, we think about how everything works together. So I qualify genetics as simple, genomics as much more complex, because it's really looking at more the bigger picture. And genetics, like the basics of genetics, is a little bit old school. It's what we've known for a long time. And that's great. That's really important. But genomics is the new stuff that we've learned. And all the interactions between all the things that we thought were happening here, and then what we know is happening now, and the edge of science, as the basics of genetics was the beginning of that area of science. And then now we're looking at the edge and we're pushing that envelope. And so we're going more towards genomics and how everything is working together in order to understand really more complex issues. So if we think about genetics, it is a gene makes a specific protein, and that gives us a specific trait. We think about genomics, we think about multiple genes and how they are regulating each other. We're also thinking about the environment and how all of that is affecting the regulation of those genes. Another newer thing for genomics as well is epigenetics. So that's the one thing that we saw before. If we just kept looking at one gene leads to a protein, leads to a trait, we wouldn't have thought about epigenetics. And actually, there's some really interesting things that we'll look at later on in the course where people actually had evidence for epigenetics before. So it's like quick evolution, where it doesn't have to have the mutation or the variation, but people didn't believe their data. So they saw this faster response to environmental factors, but people said, no, that can't happen because you haven't had enough generations to have that pass on. And so there's actually earlier evidence of epigenetics, but people ignored it because they said, no, no, this is how it works. I think that's so interesting. And so what we're going to do in this class, we are going to do a little bit of this. You have to understand this before you can get to this. But a lot of the stuff that we're going to look at is more in the genomics section, just because that's where all the newer stuff is. And in addition to genetics versus genomics, I want you to do a quick exercise before you come to class. And that is, I want you to look up what a geneticist is. And I'm just going to share the screen. You can see this a little bit better. So I want you to just Google what is a geneticist and find something interesting to share with the class. So it can be, there's so many different possibilities. So you can think about how it compares with your own personal career goals. So if you want to be a forensic science or forensic scientist, then how does a geneticist work in forensic science? Or if you want to be a medical, like work in the medical field, what do geneticists do in the medical field? Or if you want to be a genetic counselor, that's kind of a little bit more direct avenue. But I will say that as a neuroscientist, I didn't think about when I was going into it how much genetics I was going to have to think about. Because when you're really doing any kind of biology-based research, you need to know genetics. And I didn't go into science thinking, oh, I'm gonna like work in genetics or be a geneticist. But in order to answer the questions that you have, you really do have to also be a geneticist and undergo all the different types of experiments that you need in order to understand the proteins that you're working with in the lab. So there's a lot that goes into it. Oh, and also, I'm sorry, I forgot. So if you are in the PowerPoint, I also clicked on some clinical or included a link to clinical case studies. And I actually think they're kind of fun. So if you want to go into the health field, I recommend looking into those clinical case studies. And then if for your course project, you wanted to do some of those and then do a reflection on it, that would be a really good way to follow your interests if you're interested in the health field.